Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. One of the most, if not the most, high-profile recruitments in the 2025 class comes to a close Saturday afternoon as five-star offensive tackle David Sanders Jr. committing to Tennessee in the 2025 cycle. You look at David Sanders Jr., and I think it just starts with box checker. I mean, there is not a box that you are looking for an offensive tackle prospect to check that David Sanders Jr. doesn't. Now, something that I think is going to be flying really under the radar that this commitment might open people's eyes to is what Tennessee's been doing along the line of scrimmage. Hey, we're going to talk about David Sanders Jr., but I want to take a minute and just talk about what Tennessee is doing along the line of scrimmage on the high school ranks over the last couple of years. Where you look at Tennessee, you talk about Josh Heupel and this Tennessee program, a lot of the national media is going to talk about the quarterback play. It's going to talk about the explosive wide receivers. What Tennessee is doing to close the gap in the SEC, it's been along the line of scrimmage. There's no secret about that. You look at Tennessee in 2023, I thought it was a top 5 unit on the offensive line. I expect it to be a top 5 unit in the SEC in 2024 as well. Then you look at the defensive line. We might be looking at one of the better defensive lines that we see in the country in 2024, but the amount of talent that they're stacking, it's going to be an elite front seven for the next couple of years as well. You talk about how to close the gap in the SEC from teams like Georgia and Alabama, and it starts along the line of scrimmage. Tennessee is doing exactly that. As long as Josh Heupel is the coach at Tennessee, we know they're going to have an explosive offense. We know they're going to have one of the most impressive schematic offenses, but I think Josh Heupel understood that, hey, if we're going to close the gap consistently on teams like Georgia and on teams like Alabama, we got to get the line of scrimmage right. And Tennessee's quietly just been doing that over the last couple of years, and I think it kind of accumulates with a guy like David Sanders Jr. committing to Tennessee. Want to get into the film of David Sanders Jr., talk a little bit about what he brings to Tennessee. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. And it's really been a blast over the last couple of months in the summer, breaking down these commitments, talking the recruiting trail. It's something I love to do during the offseason. The amount of support y'all have continued to show, it's been absolutely amazing. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into David Sanders Jr. And let's talk about, I think you got to start with the premier athlete, right? At 6'6", 290, 36-inch arms. This kid is about as athletic of an offensive tackle I've seen come out of the high school ranks in quite a long time. He carries that 290 pounds extremely well. Now, I think what people miss on David Sanders Jr. is they look at the athleticism. They look at a rather leaner frame at 6'6", 290 and kind of just assume that he's not physically imposing as an offensive lineman. And you make no mistake, Tennessee wants to run the football. David Sanders Jr. is much more imposing than a lot of these 330-pound offensive linemen that you see are coming out in this 2025 cycle. He's extremely explosive out of his stance. I think that's where it starts. But he's extremely strong. I mean, I've seen the numbers. I've seen the clips of David Sanders Jr. in the weight room. I mean, from a pure strength standpoint, he's a lot stronger than these 300-plus offensive linemen that you're seeing come out of 2025. So when you kind of combine the strength that he has with how explosive he is out of his stance, this kid can move bodies off the line of scrimmage as well. You look at the boxes you want to see checked for offensive tackles. I mean, arm length, massive check mark for David Sanders Jr. Athleticism, very big check mark, but also that check in terms of being physically imposing and that ability to road grade and move people off the line of scrimmage, that's checked as well. That I think a lot of people don't understand is checked with David Sanders Jr. You get into the film, there's so many different things you can ask David Sanders Jr. to do. And I think what you want to focus on is he's elite in pass protection. I don't think that should come as a surprise. How athletic he is in terms of getting out to the perimeter, blocking in space, not only blocking on these type of screens, but how he works up to the second level, which is something really important in that Tennessee run game. That's probably where David Sanders Jr. excels the most. I mean, you see how routinely he can pull around to the play side, go get to the second level, get a hat on a hat. That kind of differentiates a lot of offensive linemen. There are a lot of big, powerful offensive linemen that really struggle in space. David Sanders Jr., whether it's some of these stretch concepts, whether it's pulling around to the play side, he is a tier 1 athlete at the offensive tackle spot. But when he gets hands on you, I mean, he's so good with playing with leverage. He is so good at using that length. He's so good at using that strength. This is kind of what kind of signifies it for me. He is elite out of his stance. First one out of his stance every single time. And when he gets hands on you, I mean, he can move bodies routinely off the line of scrimmage, plays with great leverage for a tackle that's 6'6", 290 pounds. So you start saying, all right, he's extremely powerful. He's a phenomenal athlete. At least in my opinion, what box does he not check? And I get this is kind of some extreme conversations we're having with David Sanders Jr. I think he's a really good football player. You talk about projecting offensive tackles, one of the more difficult positions to project to the collegiate level. You kind of just get the vibe that David Sanders Jr. is a multi-year starter in the SEC, a guy that's going to be in the discussion of a top 5 NFL draft pick in the next couple of years. It's hard to find those blue chip offensive linemen out of the high school ranks. I think that's why David Sanders Jr. got so much buzz in this high school recruitment, because he is just a blue chipper. There's not many boxes that this kid does not check. Look at him get to the second level, pick up linebackers. When he has hands on you and he's got long arms, he can get hands on you relatively well. I mean, he's just kind of putting you in the dirt. The play strength, the athleticism, it's all there for David Sanders Jr. And you take a look at Tennessee in this 2025 class, once they factor David Sanders Jr. in, going to be a top 7 class in the country. All right, we're going to get a lot of conversation about, hey, they're doing a really good job recruiting the quarterback position. We certainly know that. The quarterback play for Tennessee over the next couple of years, obviously Nico, George McIntyre, Jake Merklinger, I think is really good, and then Faze and Brandon. The quarterback play is going to be elite. But what kind of separates it for me is what Tennessee's done on the offensive line and defensive line. But you look at Douglas Utu, again, a blue chipper. I don't think he has probably the ceiling that David Sanders Jr. has. I don't think there's a single offensive lineman in the country that has the ceiling that David Sanders has. But Douglas Utu is going to be a guy that could play tackle, could play guard, is going to be a multi-year starter at the collegiate level in the SEC. You scroll down to a guy like Nick Moore, who is another really, really big fan, kind of a fire hydrant. He'll be a guard for Tennessee. So I think you got 2 premier tackles in Douglas Utu and David Sanders Jr. You got a road grader, Nick Moore, who's kind of that fire hydrant build that can move people off the line of scrimmage. I look at this Tennessee offensive line and say, that's my biggest takeaway for Tennessee. I get the quarterbacks are going to get a lot of attention. The wide receivers are going to get a lot of attention. What Tennessee's been doing on the offensive line, that's kind of what's separating me and kind of making me a believer in terms of what Josh Heupel is doing with this Tennessee program, because he's identified that, hey, that's the biggest difference between Georgia and Alabama and the rest of the teams in the SEC, how well they can physically impose teams up front along the line of scrimmage. Tennessee, from the recruiting class, is starting to become that team. And that's the storyline that I think is kind of getting lost with Tennessee over the next couple of years. This is why you're buying stock. This is a Tennessee team that is going to be elite along the line of scrimmage in the SEC. That's how you win in this conference. Josh Heupel knows it. He's getting it done on the recruiting trail. Massive news for Tennessee. We'll cut it there. Plenty of people are going to be talking about David Sanders Jr. Wanted to give you guys my 2 cents on what this commitment means for Tennessee. We'll close it there. Again, appreciate y'all rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. And we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.